Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Donald Parker from CyberSecStudy. This is episode number 2 of the CyberSecStudy Intro to Cyber program. So last episode, we talked about or defined what risk is. And here's another a chart here to give us our theory of relativity type definition for risk. Again, risk is the likelihood versus the impact of a threat exposing a vulnerability. Those 4 components: likelihood, impact, threat, vulnerability. You don't have a risk unless you have both a threat and a vulnerability, and you can't measure or assess the risk without considering both likelihood and impact. Okay? If you just have a threat and no vulnerability, you don't have a risk, don't need to do an assessment. If you identify a risk, both a threat and a vulnerability, when you assess the risk, you have to consider the likelihood of that threat overcoming the vulnerability versus the impact of that threat overcoming the vulnerability. If you don't do both, then you're not doing a risk assessment. Okay, and I've seen people talk about risk where they only talk about a vulnerability or they only talk about a threat, and then when they assess it, they only talk about the impact. They don't talk about likelihood. You have to talk about all 4 components. You have to consider all 4 components when doing a risk assessment in order to do it properly, in order to do it efficiently and effectively. All right, so I just want to give a brief example on what I would do or what I usually do when I step into a new organization for the first time. The very first thing I consider is risk. I do a risk assessment. I prioritize all the risk highs before the mediums, before the lows, and then I start implementing controls for the high risk, then the moderates. Very rarely get around to implementing controls for the low risk. Kind of just keep an eye on those. So step into an organization, the first thing I want to see is an org chart. Okay. I want to see who's at the top level, who are the middle managers, who are the lower team leads, who are the team members, the employees. I want to know what all the assets are for the organization. I want a spreadsheet, a list of all assets, from people to equipment to computers to office chairs, anything of value to an organization. It's extremely helpful if you have a business impact assessment, because that will list all of the business processes that the organization has to perform in order to achieve their objectives, right? And it'll do part of the risk assessment for you, but it can help provide information for this list of assets. Identify your assets in one column. Second column, identify their value, their monetary value. The next column, identify any vulnerabilities that exist for each of those assets. And you may have to go talk to different people at different levels of the org chart in order to identify this information. Different people may have different pieces of information about each asset. So I identify all of their vulnerabilities. From that, do some research. Find out if there have been any cyber attacks or any types of theft or destruction of similar types of assets from other companies to identify potential threats, vulnerabilities, and threats. Once you have your assets, their value, their vulnerabilities, their threats, then you can conduct a risk assessment. You have a column for likelihood, a column for impact, and then another column for overall risk rating. All right. So for each asset that you identify both a threat and a vulnerability, you're going to go through and do a risk assessment. You're going to start with a qualitative risk assessment. Over time, you'll build in quantitative elements. We'll go into more detail about that later, but you will determine the likelihood versus the impact of a threat overcoming a vulnerability to each individual asset. So that'll be your first risk assessment. And then you'll start to, once you've got that list, once you've done all the assessments for all the assets, then you'll just start to look at scenarios. What are different situations that can happen to our organization that can cause us harm? Start with your business processes. If this business process couldn't be performed, what would happen, right? Your business impact assessment could help you there. And then if you have incidents over time and you have a good enough incident response program in place to detect these incidents, then you can implement measures to prevent them from happening again and list them in your risk register and continuously build and add to your risk register so that someone or multiple people within the organization are knowledgeable about the things that could harm the organization. All right, that's it for this episode. Hit the like button if you like. Smash the subscribe button if you feel so inclined. And you can drop me a comment below, or you can reach out to me on Twitter if you want to discuss anything at CyberSecStudy.